Senator James McGrath, thanks for joining us. I want to come to the nuclear issue in a moment, but first up, this deeming decision announced by the Treasurer today, criticism that it hasn't been enough to relieve the pressure on pensioners across this country?
Oh, well, up to 1 million pensioners are going to benefit from the decision. I think a lot of people, I've just had the LNP convention on this weekend, and people I was speaking to today at the RNA showgrounds at the convention centre there, where the people there who are affected by this were pretty happy with what the Treasurer's decided. So I think he and Anne Ruston have come to a sensible landing here.
I think the lower rate, obviously, bringing that back to 1% is fine. Most people will be able to get more than 1% on their savings. But for the higher rate that kicks in, if someone has $50,000 of savings, it's still at 3%. And 3% is not available on any term deposits I was able to find today.
Well, the Treasurer and Minister Ruston have sort of explained how they've come to this decision, and we are still in pretty straightened and tightened economic circumstances, still cleaning up the mess after the last Labor government. Yeah, we're getting the budget back into black, and I'm sure the Treasurer and Anne Ruston would have liked to have gone further, but, I think they've got a good landing here, and, 1 million pensioners will benefit from it.
Tell us about that state LNP conference that's happened over the weekend. Scott Morrison obviously addressed it and asked the rhetorical question about how good Queensland is. Tell us about the issues of contention there. What about Indigenous recognition? Do you think Queensland LNP members are going to be all in favour of trying to organise a voice for Indigenous Australia, whether it's mentioned in the Constitution or not?
No, my talking to party members over the weekend, they're not enamoured of something that could end up being effectively an adjunct or a third chamber in Parliament or whichever.
Come on, there's no way known it's going to be a third chamber. You've already had Indigenous advisory councils under Labor and Liberal governments. They've acted in no way as a third chamber. This is not a third chamber. These would not be politicians. These are people representing Indigenous groups and communities, and they're asked for non-binding advice on matters pertaining to Indigenous Australians.
Yeah, well, speaking to party members over the weekend, they're not too keen on this, and the law of unintended consequences will come in terms of where this could ultimately end up. What party people are saying to me and what people out in the community are saying to me is, why aren't we focusing on the issues that impact upon Indigenous Australians in terms of the appalling infant mortality rate, suicide amongst Indigenous teenagers, life expectancy? Why aren't we focusing on those issues rather than effectively what is another talking shop? In terms of Indigenous Australians who want a voice, well, you've got an Indigenous Australian that sits around the cabinet table. You've got a shadow opposition Indigenous spokeswoman, and you've got other Indigenous members of Parliament. We'd be very, very concerned at any proposals that could have effectively, whether it's intentionally or unintentionally, I'll probably emphasise unintentionally, seek to divide Australians on the basis of race. My reading of party members in Queensland would they be very, very reluctant, if at all, to support any such proposals.
Yeah, well, I'll take up this issue in some detail later on, but there's a lot to be worked through here, and I would have thought that those practical issues, you've got to have a mechanism for Indigenous Australians to have input into those practical, high-priority issues that you mention, and this has got to be one way of doing it. It's a matter of trying to find a system that works. Look, another contentious issue that you're directly involved in is re-examining the legality, I suppose, the Australian parliaments and governments around the country, their attitude to nuclear energy. You're proposing a select committee, a Senate select committee to look at this. Do you think you're going to get something up, a re-examination of the laws around nuclear energy in this country?
Well, Keith Pett, who's the member for Hinkler, which is Bundaberg and Hervey Bay, and I have been pushing this for about a month now. Keith knows more about energy and electricity than probably the rest of the parliament combined, and what we want to do is have an adult conversation about the viability of nuclear energy, whether it can be a viable part of our energy source. Now, Keith and I have written to the Prime Minister. We've suggested some draft terms of reference. We've thought and suggested it could be a Senate Select Committee, but Keith and I are pretty open. You know, whether it's in the Senate or the House of Representatives, we would like a parliamentary inquiry, and it could be an existing standing committee to look into this issue, to enable the pros and cons of nuclear energy to be assessed, to allow Australians to have an informed debate about nuclear energy. What is really quite disappointing is that when Keith and I first proposed this about a month ago, straight out of their little sort of cave where they were all hiding after May 18, came these Labor politicians starting to run a scare campaign. Now, that's disappointing. You know, we actually want to have a serious conversation here. We want to work out whether it can be part of our energy mix. And if it is too expensive and if it's not viable, then it may get ruled out. But let's have that conversation first. Let's have an inquiry where we get experts in who can be tested in a public forum.
We know on the current information, I agree with you, it's worth examining all this because if for no other reason than the fact that technology is constantly being upgraded. But we know on the current estimates that nuclear energy is likely to be more expensive in this country than coal-generated electricity or gas-fired electricity. So what is driving this? Is it a matter of looking at new forms of electricity, even if they might cost more, to try and, because you want to reduce carbon dioxide emissions? Is that what is behind this?
Well, it's quite strange, isn't it, that we've got a third of the world's uranium here. We actually are a geographically stable country. We're a politically stable country. We export all this uranium overseas, and we're having a debate at the moment. It's been going on since, I suppose, pre-2007 about greenhouse emissions. Here is a form of energy which does not cause greenhouse gases to be emitted, and yet it's not part of the debate. We're quite prepared to subsidise billions of dollars into other forms of energy, whether it's wind or solar, which actually is quite expensive when you take into account the public subsidies. You know, we're not calling for nuclear to be subsidised by the public as such. We're calling for there to be an examination of the viability of nuclear energy. And let's have that discussion on the points that you've raised.
So it's about emissions-free power, though, isn't it? That's what's driving this debate, is emissions-free power, meeting international emissions reductions targets.
Well, it's one of the things that we think that, well, in terms of this particular form of energy, it is emissions-free. Then why we should be assessing as part of our broader energy mix across Australia? It just seems strange that we're not doing it. And you know, since we've raised this, I've been everywhere between Ingham and Roma and Blackall and Winton and every places in between. And there is support out there. People are saying, let's have this conversation. You know, people are actually going up to us in the street, which happens rarely to politicians, and going, good on you for raising this debate.
Just when it comes to this climate change issue, what do you think of Prince Charles warning us all we need to do more and that we've only got 18 months to save the planet? Is he doing a great job warning the world about this impending doom, or as the next monarch in line to rule over this country as well as the UK, should he keep his controversial opinions to himself?
It'd be nice sometimes if we applied the toddler rule to Prince Charles. You know, he should be seen and not heard. So I don't think that was a helpful contribution from Prince Charles.
Yeah, and I don't know what toddlers you know who are seen and not heard, but certainly none that I'm dealing with these days. Thanks so much for joining us, Senator James McGrath.
No, thanks, Chris.